My sister said, "Come by for a casual family brunch, we'll squeeze you in." When I got there was no seat for me. My mom pointed to a bar stool in the corner. "That's fine for you, right?" I nodded, ordered a latte, then handed my card to the server and said, "I'd like to close out, but move the rest of the charges to table 7. 30 minutes later, my brother stood up and yelled, "Who the hell put $1,300 on my bill?" Danielle's text had arrived that morning with the same effortless tone she used whenever she wanted to make exclusion sound generous. "Come by for a casual family brunch. We'll squeeze you in." Squeeze me in. I stared at those words longer than I should have. Everyone else was automatically included in family gatherings. Nobody squeezed in Danielle. Nobody squeezed in Nate or Kevin or my parents. I was always the optional person, invited after reservations were made, plans were finalized, and photographs were apparently already arranged in everyone's minds. Still, I went. My name is Erica, and for most of my adult life I had built a reputation in my family for being easygoing, independent, chill. Those were their favorite words for me. What they really meant was that I rarely made them uncomfortable when they treated me badly. I arrived 10 minutes early. Early enough, I thought, to help everyone settle in, or at least claim a seat before the place became crowded. Instead, the entire family was already there. 9 chairs surrounded the long table, and all 9 were occupied. Plates were out. Drinks were half finished. My parents sat together near the center. Danielle was beside her husband. Nate sat with his fiancée. Kevin had brought his new girlfriend. Even Uncle Mark, who appeared at family events about as often as a solar eclipse, somehow had a proper chair. 9 people, 9 seats, no 10th. I stood near the end of the table for several seconds, waiting for someone to react. A hello would have been enough. Nate glanced at me briefly and continued telling his story. Danielle didn't look up. My dad kept talking. Finally, Mom noticed me with the mild irritation of someone realizing the waiter had brought the wrong side dish. She pointed toward the bar. "That's fine for you, right?" I followed her finger. One stool sat by itself near the corner, inches from a service station stacked with used glasses. Nobody laughed. Nobody offered to grab another chair. Nobody said they were sorry. So I walked over and sat down. From there, I had an excellent view of my family enjoying themselves without me. Danielle threw her head back, laughing at something Kevin said. Nate poured Prosecco around the table, as if he were hosting a private celebration. Dad told one of his stories with that smug little smile he got whenever he knew everyone was listening. They looked like a family. I looked like a customer who happened to recognize them. I ordered a latte. That was it. I drank slowly and watched. No one asked whether I wanted food. Nobody suggested shifting the table. More dishes arrived, then more drinks, small plates, entrees. Another bottle of Prosecco because Kevin's girlfriend wanted to try it. Nate held the bottle up and examined the label like he had suddenly become a sommelier. Watching them spend freely while pretending I wasn't there, something inside me became strangely calm. If they wanted me to be an outsider, I could behave like one. Outsiders pay their own bill and leave. When the server walked by, I caught her attention. "Could I get my check?" She returned a moment later. $5.75. My latte. I gave her my card, then nodded toward my family's table. "I'd like to close mine out, but could you move the remaining charges to table 7? She paused. Her eyes moved from me to them and back again. Maybe she sensed there was a story there. Maybe she simply didn't care. Either way, she nodded. I left half the latte in the cup, walked through the front doors, and never looked behind me. I was halfway home when Kevin texted. "Nate is freaking out. Someone put the entire tab on his card. Over $1,300. He literally stood up yelling. Everyone is staring." I read it twice, pulled into my driveway, went inside, made myself a sandwich, and turned on the television. I didn't respond. For years they had told me there was never enough space. That afternoon, Nate discovered there was apparently plenty of space on his credit card. The next morning was almost peaceful. I sat outside with coffee while my phone displayed 4 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Nate, 1 from Danielle, plus several voicemails. Mom sounded stern. "Call me as soon as you get this. We need to talk about yesterday." Nate sounded furious. "Fix this, Erica. Seriously, don't be a jerk." Danielle sounded insulted on behalf of civilization itself. "I don't know what you thought you were doing, but I covered the bill, so we're going to discuss this today." I deleted them. Around 10, I heard the front gate shut. Ryan, my boyfriend, looked through the kitchen window. "Danielle's here." Of course she was. When I opened the door, Danielle walked past me holding some iced drink from a place that printed names in gold across the cup. "No, hello." She stopped in our living room and announced, "I covered that tab yesterday. More than $1,300. I said nothing. She waited, apparently expecting gratitude. "I didn't have to," she continued, "but I did because I don't make scenes. I don't ruin family gatherings. I solve things." I leaned against the wall and watched her build the argument she had obviously rehearsed on the drive over. "I don't know what your little stunt was supposed to prove, but congratulations. You got attention. Everyone is talking about it. You embarrassed Nate in front of the entire restaurant. You embarrassed all of us." That was when I understood something important. Danielle wasn't really furious about $1,300. She was furious because I had changed the rules. I was supposed to absorb the humiliation quietly. I was supposed to smile from the corner, pay whatever I was expected to pay later, and remain the convenient sister who never forced anyone to examine what they were doing. "You could have said something," she snapped. "Instead, you behaved like a spoiled child. It was selfish." I finally looked directly at her. "You think what I did was selfish? You invited me to family brunch and put me on a stool beside dirty dishes while everyone else sat together. We were full. You made the reservation. We figured you'd be fine. You're independent." I almost laughed. "Right. Translation. You don't care where I sit as long as I don't interfere with the family picture." Danielle crossed her arms. "You've changed. You used to be chill. Now you're bitter." That was when Ryan walked out of the kitchen, set the towel in his hand on the counter, and said quietly, "She isn't bitter, Danielle. She's tired." Danielle's face hardened. "I'm not talking to you." Ryan didn't move. "You came into our house to call Erica selfish while you've been living rent-free in a house she owns for 22 months. The room went completely still. And suddenly brunch wasn't the biggest problem anymore. Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 22 months, he repeated. Free house, utilities covered, property taxes covered, repairs handled, and you walked in here to explain to Erica what selfishness looks like? Danielle's face flushed so quickly it was almost impressive. "Stay out of this," she snapped. "This is family." Ryan gave her a small, humorless smile. "That's convenient, because when you need money, Erica is family. When you're making brunch reservations, she's apparently furniture." Danielle opened her mouth again, but Ryan was already at the door. He didn't touch her the way an angry person would. He simply opened it, stood beside it, and waited. The message was clear. Danielle looked at me, clearly expecting me to overrule him. For years, I probably would have. Instead, I said nothing. She grabbed her purse, muttered that I was making a huge mistake, and stormed out. The door closed behind her, and the silence afterward felt heavier than the argument. Ryan looked at me and said, "You've been too generous for too long." That was the sentence that finally broke through everything. The house Danielle lived in belonged to me. I had bought it years earlier as an investment property, and when her husband lost his job, I let them move in for what was supposed to be 6 months. They had 2 kids, and I didn't want them scrambling between relatives while they got back on their feet. Danielle cried the day I handed her the keys. She hugged me and told me I was saving their lives. 6 months became 9, because her husband was waiting for the right position. 9 became 12, because they were finally saving. Then he started calling himself a consultant, which mostly seemed to involve sitting at home waiting for imaginary clients while rejecting regular jobs because the salaries were supposedly insulting. At some point, nobody even mentioned moving anymore. My favor had become infrastructure. I paid taxes, major repairs, and insurance. They paid nothing close to market rent. Eventually, nothing at all. And somehow I was still the selfish one, because I didn't enjoy eating brunch beside the dirty glasses. By 2 that afternoon, I had called the property management company. I explained that my financial support arrangement was ending, and I wanted the formal process started. Danielle and her family would receive notice to vacate. 2 weeks. No special extension. No private arrangement. No conversation about just 1 more month. I asked for everything in writing. The woman handling the property paused for a moment before confirming the request, almost as if she expected me to change my mind. I didn't. When the email arrived for final approval, I read it twice and clicked send. Clean language. No accusations. No family history. No mention of brunch. Just dates, responsibilities, and notice. Facts were powerful because Danielle couldn't cry over them until they changed shape. My phone started vibrating before dinner. Danielle called twice. Mom called next. Nate followed. I let all 3 ring. Then came the messages. Danielle, are you serious? You're throwing us out over brunch? Mom, Erica, this is too far. There are children involved. Whatever happened yesterday does not justify this. Danielle again. You're really proud of yourself, aren't you? You always were jealous of me. That one made me laugh out loud. Jealous of what exactly? The unpaid bills? The husband who turned down jobs while someone else funded his roof? The ability to humiliate the person paying for your life and still expect her to apologize? Ryan and I cooked dinner and left the phones face down. Neither of us said much. We didn't have to. For the first time, I wasn't trying to predict which family member I needed to calm down next. The next morning brought more missed calls, including one from Dad, who had barely spoken to me in months. His text was short. We don't always agree with Danielle, but she's still your sister. Don't let this become permanent. Permanent! Interesting word. Nobody had worried about permanence when Danielle's temporary 6-month arrangement crossed the 2-year mark. Nobody worried about the permanent habit of excluding me from plans while depending on my money. Around noon, Danielle arrived outside our house. She didn't knock. She parked on the street with both children in the car and began texting. We need to talk. Then, I didn't sleep. Then, please don't do this to the kids. Ryan looked through the window and immediately said, Don't open that door. I wasn't going to. Danielle stayed 15 minutes, using the children's presence like emotional leverage. Eventually, the messages stopped, and the minivan drove away. The pressure came in waves after that. Mom sent pictures of Danielle's children playing at a park with the message, Do this for them. Nate left a voicemail trying to sound casual. Come on, Erica. You made your point. It's getting ridiculous now. Danielle sent a long email where every paragraph began with some version of, I know I've made mistakes, but somehow ended with reasons I should continue supporting her. Nobody understood the simplest part. I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't teaching Danielle a lesson. I wasn't waiting for an apology before restoring everything. I was simply finished. There is a difference between punishing someone and refusing to keep rescuing them, but people who benefit from your lack of boundaries rarely appreciate that distinction. On the 6th day, Danielle called and I answered. She wasn't yelling this time. She was crying. Not the dramatic crying from before, but the exhausted kind that comes when someone realizes the threat might actually be real. We have nowhere to go, she said. I thought you would cool down. I stayed quiet. I never thought you would actually do this to me. I was counting on you. There it was. Counting on me. Not grateful for me. Not planning around me. Counting on me like I was a utility that had always worked. When she finally stopped, I said, You were supposed to stay 6 months. You've had almost 2 years. She whispered, So this is punishment? No, I said. This is reality. You're angry because I finally stopped protecting you from it. She went silent. A few seconds later, the call ended. The next morning, an unfamiliar number called twice. When it rang the second time, Ryan looked at the screen and said, "Answer it. I'm curious who joins the committee next." I picked up. A woman introduced herself as Diane, Danielle's mother-in-law. Her voice was polite in the specific way people sound when they believe politeness makes intrusion respectable. She said she understood there had been some tension. Then she called the eviction dramatic and suggested I reconsider because children were involved. "They'll stay with us temporarily," she said, "but maybe you could support them another month or two while we help them transition. It would keep things civil." Civil? I almost admired the word. Diane and her husband had never offered to help Danielle when she lost the house the first time. They had never asked what I was paying. They hadn't invited me to holidays or even bothered to learn much about my life. But now that their son and grandchildren might become their financial responsibility, suddenly civility required my wallet. "I'm not paying another month," I said. "There's nothing to revisit." Diane sighed. "I hope you come to your senses." I already did. That ended the call. By the following day, messages started arriving from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, and family friends who had never once asked whether I was okay. "You should be ashamed. Those kids don't deserve this." Family is family. Danielle had apparently rewritten the story. In her version, I had abruptly thrown a struggling mother and 2 children into homelessness after a petty disagreement. Missing were the 22 months of support, the 0 rent, the rejected jobs, and the fact that she had treated the person funding her life like an inconvenience. Ryan took my phone, blocked each number, and handed it back without comment. On the 10th day, I came home and found Danielle's minivan outside my house. This time, her husband was with her. Boxes were stacked near the curb beside a folded crib. The children sat in the van looking confused. Danielle stood on the porch, crying loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. Ryan opened the door before I could reach it. "What is this?" he asked. Danielle spun around. "You got what you wanted," she said to me. "You ruined everything." Her husband stayed beside the boxes with his arms crossed, clearly embarrassed but not embarrassed enough to stop the performance. Danielle pointed toward their belongings. "This is what happens when family turns on you. We have nowhere. We're leaving town." I nodded. "Okay." She stared at me as though I had spoken another language. "You're not even sorry?" I thought about that for a moment. "I was sorry for years," I said. "I'm not anymore." Ryan leaned against the doorway. "If you need someone to blame, blame us. Just don't come back when the next plan fails." Danielle waited several more seconds, probably hoping the sight of the crib or the children would make me cave. It didn't. Finally, she climbed into the minivan, slammed the door, and drove away. I stood there watching the vehicle disappear, convinced that was finally the end. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived. Heavy paper. Formal language. Diane and her husband were threatening to sue me for emotional distress, disruption of family stability, forced displacement, and transitional housing expenses. I read the document once, then again, and actually laughed. Ryan didn't. He looked at the letter and said, "Enough. This isn't family drama anymore. Get a lawyer." So I did. By the end of that afternoon, I had retained an attorney and sent him every lease document, payment record, message, voicemail, and email I had saved. The next day, his office issued a formal response warning Diane and her husband against further harassment, defamatory claims, or attempts to pressure me for money. Danielle suddenly became silent. Nate didn't. He showed up at my office without an appointment, walked past reception, and stood in my doorway, with the expression of a man convinced he was about to deliver the speech that would finally fix me. "You're seriously going to destroy the whole family over some brunch?" he demanded. I looked at him for a few seconds and realized how ridiculous the question was. This had never been about brunch. Brunch was just the first time I stopped pretending. I pointed toward the hallway. Out. Nate waited for more. There wasn't any. Eventually, he turned and walked away. That evening, I went home and started removing every remaining connection. Danielle was deleted as an emergency contact. I withdrew my share from an old family investment account Dad had asked me to help manage years earlier. I left the shared calendar, the group chats, the streaming accounts, the family apps, everything. I removed myself from obligations I had accepted because I thought belonging required constant usefulness. Ryan watched from across the room as my phone became quieter with every tap. When I finished, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. If people insist on treating you like a stranger, eventually you're allowed to stop performing the duties of family. And when the last group chat disappeared from my screen, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. That weekend, Ryan and I disappeared into the mountains for 2 nights. It wasn't some dramatic escape or celebration. We rented a small cabin where the road narrowed into gravel and cell service, vanished somewhere between the last gas station and the first line of pine trees. For 48 hours, my phone was useless, and I discovered how badly I had needed that. There were no relatives demanding explanations, no unknown numbers carrying somebody else's version of Danielle's story, no messages beginning with family should, or ending with some variation of after everything we've done for you. Ryan made coffee in the mornings while I sat outside wrapped in a blanket, listening to nothing except wind moving through the trees. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting another emergency that somehow required me to solve it. By Sunday afternoon, I had stopped checking. It occurred to me that most of the emergencies in my family had only been emergencies because everyone knew I would eventually handle them. When we pulled into our driveway Sunday evening, I turned my phone back on. Messages downloaded, notifications appeared, then disappeared as the apps caught up. There was only one message from Danielle. "We're gone. Don't worry. You win." I stared at it for several seconds. Even after everything, she still needed the story to have a winner and a loser. If I refused to continue financing her life, I had won. If she moved out of a house she had been allowed to occupy almost free for nearly 2 years, she had lost. There was no version where she simply accepted responsibility. I showed Ryan. He read it, handed the phone back, and said, "You don't have to answer that." I already knew. I deleted it. That was the last direct message Danielle sent me. 3 weeks passed. At first, the silence made me suspicious. I expected another certified letter, another surprise visit, another cousin suddenly remembering my number. Nothing came. Then something strange happened. I started sleeping through the night. Ryan noticed before I did. One morning he asked, "Do you realize you haven't checked your phone once since we sat down?" I looked at it on the counter and realized he was right. Our house changed too. Ryan started playing music while he cooked again. I started reading before bed instead of scrolling through family messages, trying to decide whether ignoring them made me cruel. We took evening walks and left our phones at home. There had always been this low-level tension beneath everything, as if someone might call at any second with another demand disguised as a crisis. Once that disappeared, I understood just how much space my family had been occupying inside a life they rarely bothered to participate in unless they needed something. Early one Monday morning, the property manager called. "They're completely out," she told me. "Keys returned. Place is empty. A couple broken blinds, but nothing serious." I almost didn't believe her. I had expected Danielle to leave some final statement, a damaged wall, piles of garbage, maybe an angry note taped to the refrigerator. Instead, there was nothing. I drove over after work. The moment I opened the front door, I was hit by that hollow echo empty houses have. No toys, no furniture, no family photographs. Just dusty floors, picture hooks in the walls, and pale rectangles where furniture had protected the paint from sunlight. I walked into the living room and remembered standing in almost the exact same spot nearly 2 years earlier, handing Danielle the keys. She had cried that day. Real tears. She wrapped both arms around me and said, "Erica, you're saving us. I swear we just need 6 months. At the time, I believed gratitude had a long memory. I had been wrong. It took about 3 months before favors became expectations. Ryan came with me the following weekend. We walked from room to room without saying much. In one bedroom, a glow-in-the-dark star was still stuck to the ceiling from one of the kids. Seeing it hurt more than I expected. None of this had ever been about wanting Danielle's children to suffer. That was the part everyone had deliberately twisted. I had wanted their parents to become responsible for them, instead of turning responsibility into something I inherited because I had the resources to carry it. Ryan must have seen something in my face because he reached for my hand. "You gave them almost 2 years," he said. "Remember that." I nodded. Then I called the agent and told her to list the house as it was. I didn't renovate it. I didn't keep it sitting empty in case Danielle changed her mind. I didn't leave some secret door open for the old arrangement to restart. The house went on the market. It was under contract in less than 10 days. When the agent called with the offer, I accepted after reviewing the numbers and felt almost nothing. No triumph, no guilt, mostly relief. I never told Danielle the property was being sold. For a moment, that felt strange, because for almost 2 years every decision involving that house had somehow required considering her feelings first. Then I remembered something simple. It was my house. She had moved out. She had no lease, no financial interest, and no reason to be consulted. Selling it wasn't another message to her. In fact, the healthiest part was that it had nothing to do with her at all. When the sale closed, I moved the proceeds into my own accounts and removed the property from the mental list of things my family could someday pressure me to provide again. Ryan and I used a small portion of the money to take an actual vacation. We rented a cabin in Maine perched above the ocean where the mornings were gray, cold, and completely quiet except for the waves below. Ryan slept until noon on our second day because, according to him, he hadn't slept that deeply in months. I cooked breakfast at lunchtime, and we ate looking through huge windows toward the water. We barely discussed Danielle. That surprised me. I thought getting away would finally give us time to dissect everything, but there was nothing left to dissect. Some relationships end with a revelation. Others end when you finally stop arguing with what they have shown you repeatedly. My family had shown me where I stood. The difference was that I no longer needed them to admit it. When we came home, I finished removing the last administrative ties. Old insurance documents still listed Danielle as an emergency contact, so I replaced her with Ryan. A medical form had Mom listed as the person to call if I couldn't make decisions for myself. I changed that too. I closed an old shared family account that had remained open mostly because no one had bothered to deal with it. I deleted the family calendar from my phone. Birthdays disappeared from my screen. Anniversary reminders vanished. It felt strange watching years of automatic notifications disappear with a few taps, but I wasn't deleting people from existence. I was deleting the machinery that had kept me performing closeness, where very little closeness actually existed. The last thing I changed wasn't financial or digital. On the stairwell wall hung an old Christmas photograph from almost 10 years earlier. We were all wearing matching sweaters because Mom had insisted on it. Danielle was leaning against me. Nate was making some ridiculous face. Dad had one hand on my shoulder. Everyone was smiling. For years I had passed that photograph every morning and never really looked at it. That evening, I stopped. I remembered how desperately I used to want the family in that picture to be real all the time, not just for the 3 seconds it took a camera shutter to click. I took the frame down. Ryan watched from the hallway but didn't say anything. I didn't smash it or tear the picture. I wrapped it carefully, put it in a box, and carried it into the attic. It wasn't an act of anger. It simply didn't belong on the wall anymore. December came quietly. No Christmas card from Danielle. No frantic group chat about who was bringing dessert. No message from Mom 3 days before the annual brunch saying they had found room for me. Christmas morning, Ryan and I made breakfast, exchanged gifts, and spent half the day in pajamas. At one point, I caught myself thinking about the restaurant, the lonely stool by the dirty glasses, the 9 chairs already occupied, Mom pointing at the corner as though she were doing me a favor. For years, I thought my problem was that my family wouldn't give me a proper seat at their table. I kept proving my value, paying bills, solving crises, offering houses, swallowing insults, hoping one day they would finally look at me and realize I belonged there without needing to be squeezed in. The truth was simpler. I had been fighting for a seat at a table where everyone was comfortable watching me stand. Once I understood that, leaving stopped feeling like failure. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need Danielle to apologize, Mom to admit she favored everyone else, Nate to understand why the brunch mattered, or Dad to call and tell me I had been right. Closure wasn't them finally agreeing with me. Closure was waking up and realizing their agreement no longer controlled the shape of my life. I had spent years believing family meant staying no matter how small they made you feel. Now I understood something different. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is stop asking people to make room. You build another table. You choose who sits there, and you never again confuse being tolerated with being loved.